Okay, Madam Chair, please go ahead.
Thanks, Brittany. Okay, welcome everybody. I see some new faces here. So this should be an exciting meeting to get the update from our consultants. I will call the meeting to order at 10:03. Welcome, Danuta. I do see that one item has been left off, a standing item, and that's our land acknowledgement statement. So I will read that now and just ask staff that be included with each meeting per protocol, please and thank you. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Anishinaabe, the people of the Three Fires known as Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi Nation, who have inhabited this land from time immemorial. And further, give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. We also recognize the Métis and Inuit, whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. May we all as treaty people live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples. Okay, everyone has the agenda. I would just ask that we move to approve the agenda, but first, are there any changes or additions to the agenda that anyone has noted? Nope. Okay, someone to move that we approve the agenda as it stands. Thank you, Danuta. All in favor? And that's carried. Thank you. Declaration of pecuniary interest, please go ahead and declare that now or at any point in time during the meeting, should that apply to you. Moving down to item number 4, minutes of the previous meeting, January 20th, 2022. The recommendation is that the minutes of that Climate Action Committee meeting be adopted. Someone to move that recommendation forward. Thank you, Bob. And are there any comments on those minutes that we should discuss? Any errors or omissions? Luke?
Yeah, Madam Chair. Question about item number 8.2. There was a climate update, climate action plan update, and it was rightfully listed. We had a number of questions and comments. I just wanted to clarify. Was there, to what extent, we talked briefly also about the timelines for the communal plan. So we have the Woods action plan, or the Gantt chart for the corporate work. I thought we also discussed that there maybe would be an update in terms of the work plan for the community work, the community action plan.
Okay, so
just want to verify if that's still forthcoming or what we do with that.
So sorry, Luke, just to clarify, you're speaking to the action plan or the work plan of the committee itself, as opposed to the work plan of staff and the consultant?
The work plan for the development of the community-focused climate action plan, as opposed to the corporate-focused climate action plan.
So that would fall under Trevor's purview, I believe. Is that correct? Trevor, is that so? Let me just back it up a step here. Are you wanting a change made to the minutes of January 20th, Luke, or are you just asking that business be brought forward from those minutes to the agenda today?
Well, it was more, and I haven't looked back at the tape, and I should probably have done that, but it was more that we have been talking about the work plan for a while, since August. So and that's, you know, we haven't had much of an update other than looking at some of the milestones. So we had a discussion about what are the next steps looking like, and I think the work that Wood is doing is helpful. Has a timeline, has some steps involved, but we haven't seen what we talked about last time, as well as, for example, when is community consultation taking place and what are the different steps in terms of determining the steps towards a community-based climate action plan. And I thought that we agreed that there was a And either an independent plan or a critique on the plan that the working group established last year in terms of the steps towards, getting these action plans developed and towards implementation.
Okay, so I wonder if we need to, to add that to the agenda then, for today, that discussion. And we could bring that back under unfinished business under number 9, Luke.
Sure.
If now we have approved the agenda, Brittany, I'm just asking you procedurally, do we need to go back and no, we're good. Okay, thank you. So that's the work plan, the community action plan, right, Luke?
Yeah, correct. The development of the community-based climate action plan. Yeah.
Okay. I do note the other thing that seems to be missing from the agenda, and I'll take responsibility for that because I did discuss this agenda with our CAO and I missed it, is oh, no, I'm sorry, it is there under staff reports. So I wonder if it would be more appropriate for that item to come up under staff reports. Perhaps it will be addressed there as well. So I'll just move that up under number 7. Okay, Cynthia.
Thank you, Chair Coburn. And I think just to Luke's question, what we might want to do is get an overview of the our consultants update for us. And I know that that's focused more on the corporate side of things, but I do think the community action plan will dovetail from that as well. And so I'm not sure how much of an update we can provide today, but absolutely noted for our next meeting. Perhaps we can come back with a more robust update on that community side of the equation. I think we're going to get into quite a discussion today with our consultants on how they see developing the climate action plan. So I think if we can consider that as maybe next month's agenda item, I think we'll fill a lot of time today with just questions from the presentation that we're about to receive. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think we will, if it's okay with committee, I think we will leave that on the agenda today, but perhaps after the presentation by our consultants, some of the questions that are asked during that time following the presentation, it might be addressed then. And certainly we can hear from Trevor at that time as well, since that is his role largely. Okay, so thanks, Luke, for bringing that forward. Any comments on the minutes, or can we vote to have those approved? Those are the minutes from January 20th. All in favor of approving those minutes? Okay, and that carries. Thank you. All right, we have a delegation that we are very much looking forward to hearing from. These are our consultants, Wood Consulting. I have not met these folks, but I would like to say welcome on behalf of the committee. And I don't know if staff would like to introduce these folks, or if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourselves and go straight into your presentation. I'll leave that up to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us to your meeting today. We look forward to really getting into the heart of the project that we've been assigned. Have had some conversations with people on this call, and look forward to engaging more directly with this committee on the work that we're doing. Now I'm going to hand it over to, actually I was going to hand it over to my colleague, but perhaps as Chair Coburn has indicated, just do a brief introduction. My name is Peter Nemrichter. I'm the Climate Resilience Lead for Wood for Canada. If you don't know Wood, we are a global engineering consultancy of about, I think at last count, about 50,000 people. My world is very much climate change and climate resilience as it relates to infrastructure. I've been doing this kind of work since about 2005. My broader career, I'm a 32-year professional engineer and with an expertise in flood risk assessment and urban stormwater management. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Brian Montgomery. He can introduce himself and then begin the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Brian Montgomery. I'm also with Wood. I am the climate risk specialist, sustainability, and what my background is, I'm very familiar with Ontario. I spent 20 years of my life in the city of Hamilton doing greenhouse gas inventories and climate adaptation work. Last couple of years of my life, I went up to the north, so the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, working with First Nations and the Inuit on climate adaptation plans and climate risk assessments. And currently I'm calling in from the lovely part of the interior of BC, where I reside right now, of Caslow, BC, in the West Kootenays area. So between about 8 hours from Vancouver and 4 hours from Calgary, right on the borderlands of Alberta and BC. And my background, as I said, is more on the climate change inventory work. So I will be driving a lot of the work on the corporate and looking at some of the data from the community side. So that's an excellent question about where you guys might be in the community plan and development. And a lot of my adaptation risk is Peter is definitely my knowledge person for risks on climate change. I've done sort of some weather impacts, but learning more strongly through Peter's work on risk.
So just, do you want us to drive the presentation? Okay, you've got that on hand, Brian, I assume?
Yeah, I'm just looking for that lovely button that tells me I can actually share something.
Okay.
Mr. Montgomery, it's at the top right-hand screen of your corner beside your microphone.
Ah, thank you.
Okay, I see it.
Wonderful. So good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Climate Action Committee, and staff of the Township of Georgian Bluffs. This presentation will be stepping into developing your climate action plan for the Township of Georgian Bluffs. We've introduced ourselves. Peter and myself both work and represent Wood. First slide, getting right into the work and the timelines and the process. We have been hired and began the work as of January. So we had an initial kickoff meeting with the staff. We are working on this project until the end of July. If we can get it done sooner, wonderful. Each of these steps gets into breaking down what we are looking at in your climate change action plan. We are looking at not only the mitigation side, so it is your reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but we're also incorporating a risk assessment and looking at the assets, so the infrastructure, from a climate adaptation. So what the weather impacts, extreme weather impacts might be, what that means for services and what it means for the assets of the township, and combining that into a plan that looks at the corporate operations to say, here's where corporately you can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, and here's the risks that might be happening to your assets from changes in the climate. As well, there may be some components to it that will dovetail into the development of a community climate change plan. So the lens for my greenhouse gas mitigation work is I've had some great discussions with Grey County on their climate action plan, and we're going to integrate some of those activities, but mostly looking at a snapshot of data that tells you as your community where you're at from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view, and that will help you build a community plan from that starting point. The stars on this process is where we would definitely like to talk to you. We're interested in talking to you as a committee. So we currently are looking at any changes, impacts, or current actions that are underway that you're aware of the township. So we've been talking to the staff about that, reading staff reports. But if there are certain things that you're aware of that you'd like us to be aware of in the process, that there may be some impacts from weather that's happened in the community or infrastructure that you're aware of, please reach out. We will be reporting a draft greenhouse gas report, so there will be updates during the process of the report of the emissions and where the risks are in terms of the likely weather events that will happen. We'll then also have feedback onto a climate strategy. So we're not going to work on a township plan. The game of the strategy is not to make this work in isolation. It needs to consider the corporate strategic plan, the official community plan of the Township of Georgian Bluffs, should be integrated with some of the work that Grey County is doing on climate action, because you are in a wider region. Just things that the province requires, both from an energy reporting point of view, greenhouse gas reduction point of views, and asset management, as well as the federal strategies that are out there as well. So questions around, do we wish to lead to net zero and support the federal government in their actions internationally? From there, once we got some input onto the draft report, we were looking at the climate strategy. We're looking at a follow-up, updating that draft report, and you will have a look at the final draft climate change plan. Ultimately, of course, the presentation will be to, and the acceptance of the plan will be from the council of the Township of Georgian Bluffs. You're probably, as a number of members, are probably very familiar with this very similar. This is the infamous climate change Venn diagram. The purpose for this slide is just to remind you that a robust climate change action plan doesn't necessarily just look at the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of actions. We're also incorporating adaptation. So the actions you need to prepare for and recover from impacts of climate change and extreme weather. And these are examples of where some actions will be specifically around climate change action, whether it's updating emergency response plans at the corporate level or in your community to address climate change. You have your heat alerts and your flood responses. You may also have to look at the climate readiness of the township operations. So again, the water treatment plants, the biogas, and also the bridges and the infrastructure there, the buildings, perhaps your community centers. From mitigation point of view, very much tradition. A lot of people are very emphasize energy conservation efficiency, active or low carbon transportation. That includes electric vehicle fleets, renewable energy. My understanding is in Georgian Bluffs, there are some solar panels that are on roofs that are being rented out on your community. The easy things that people can do at home. So home gardening and supporting your local farmer market. So food security. What I like to emphasize is there are actions that we're going to look at in the plan corporately, and dovetail into some community activities. What can you do that can be both mitigative, so reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? And the reason we want to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions is, I remind people, even if we haven't taken action now, we're still emitting. This is influencing extreme weather events. So we need to look at things like water conservation. I always like the term permeable pavement. Coming from a rural area myself, I always tell people this is called gravel roads. So not necessarily does everything need to be paved because you want better water infiltration. There will be, I know there's interest in natural assets, so forestry and wetlands, from not only a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but how they can adapt to the changes. Local food, as I mentioned, and better building. So not necessarily taking a mitigation point of a building that can reduce energy, but also looking at some considerations on how buildings could be built in order to deal with flood events, in terms of forest fires and activities like that would have extreme weather events, and also thinking about air quality. So you can have how you can have air filters or air shelters in your buildings. And Peter, would you like to talk about the risk side?
Sure, thanks, Brian. Yeah, we are, within the context of the overall project on the risk assessment side, looking at a variety of township infrastructure that covers roads, bridges, buildings. There's within your asset management plan, there's a category referenced as land development, which includes a number of recreational facilities and other assets that we feel are part of the conversation around what infrastructure should be included into the scope. And there are two categories within the asset management plan, equipment and vehicles, that we have discussed with some of your colleagues that we feel doesn't really fall into the realm of what would typically be included in a climate risk from assessment from an infrastructure perspective, mostly because those assets are considered more disposable, and the influence of the township, its ability to modify the design or operations of those particular assets isn't really relevant to a longer term climate vision. So we're looking at a variety of climate risks, and we typically start with a long list. We have typically about 30 climate hazards generally under the monikers of temperature, precipitation, and wind. And then we look at all the variations therein. If we talk about precipitation, various typical design rainfall events related to intensity, duration, frequency, and how those relationships might change under the influence of climate change moving forward. Wind, tornadoes. I think generally the township is a little bit north of Ontario's Tornado Alley, but still needs to be a consideration. And if not tornado, just extreme wind. We've had some interesting wind events, in the province over the years, and we are using an assessment protocol that was developed by Engineers Canada, which is now being co-managed by a variety of groups led by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. I was part of the team that developed the original protocol back in about 2006 and have used it on, I haven't counted them all up, but probably about 50 projects between its original development and now. And the idea is to look at the expected occurrence of climate phenomena in the historic context, current context, and then in the future context. So with Trevor and our project steering committee looking at establishing time frames and those future scenarios around the various RCP type scenarios, 4.5, 8.5, that are available from a data point of view that allow us to provide context to these climate parameters in the future. From that, and we look at the various infrastructure elements to try to understand if particular hazards do occur, what their severity of impact might be to individual infrastructure components, whether that be loss of service or direct damages to infrastructure, trying to quantify those in a risk framework. And then, an action plan to mitigate, and it's unfortunate that we talk about mitigation and mitigating risks, but looking at how we might, what recommendations can we make to the township to mitigate risks moving forward, whether that be change in policy, capital works, and in some cases the information doesn't exist to found a reasonable recommendation. So in some cases we may advance a recommendation to gather more information, do more analysis. But along with that then comes, who should champion certain actions, what is the realm of cost that we think might be associated with those, to initiate the development of a roadmap or action plan that the township can then start to follow. Back to you, Brian.
All right, and just wanted to point out to the committee, the bottom of the slide is the picture of the ICLES, BARC, Building Adaptation and Resilient Cities, milestone. So part of the project that we're working on with the town, for you as the township of Georgian Blast, is to get you guys to the milestone 3, both on an adaptation point of view and a mitigation point of view. So just want to congratulate you all that myself being familiar with the Federation of Municipalities and their milestone projects, from an adaptation point of view, congratulations, you're already past milestone 1, which may be a simple step, but it's initiating the process and forming the committee that you have right now. So we're now actually into milestone 2, which is what Peter is working on, is the researching on what the assets are and the weather impacts. I talk more on the mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The milestone process for this is milestones 1 to 3 is the scope of the work. I am currently underway on the creating your baseline, your emissions inventory, and your forecasting. So I'm looking at the assets, but also community aspects of this as well. So for the township and community sources of greenhouse gas emissions, baseline year is 2018. The reason for this is there is energy data that I have from the township that begins in 2018. So I have data from 2018 all the way to 2020. I'm getting some data for 2021. So I know where you have been as corporately and where you could be going forecasting wise. I'm also familiar with the Grey County Climate Action Plan, which also uses 2018 as a baseline from their point of view. So there's a recommendation for community sources that we have a common baseline. And this helps because that means corporate emissions and community emissions can be using the same baseline, and there's no confusion when we set the targets as to what the first year of reporting and work and data collection was. I look at, or I should say, an inventory looks at a number of aspects in the corporate and community realm. We look at energy. So energy coming from buildings, whether those are residential buildings, so houses, whether that's energy coming from commercial sectors, so anything from a warehouse to a shopping mall, institutional, hospitals, community centers, schools, libraries, energy from industrial sources. So fortunately, you're not having large industries such as a steel factory or a chemical factory, but if there are industrial sources, I capture that as well. And that gives us a sense of where not only the energy is being used, but where emissions are coming from. So some actions and policies may be directly what the township owns and operates and they can control. Other things will be things where we need to influence through policy or through working with partnerships, whether it is at the federal level or the provincial level of Ontario, to work with those sectors to help them reduce their emissions. Transportation, I look at fleets. So the makeup of the Township of Georgian Bluffs fleets, from the snowplows to the trucks that are being used for services. I look at transportation in terms of commuting habits, the transportations of how many people in the community are using a car, a truck, looking at transit in the region. From water, we look at the energy usage being used in water treatment, the water flows, waste, how much garbage is being created in your community, how much is going to landfills, but looking at the two streams, recycling as well as non-recyclables. Wastewater, how much water is being treated, and how many users of them. And then land use and agriculture, I'm looking at the official community plan to look at what the land use changes are being, what population growth will be, what the agricultural uses are, not only just of livestock, but also commercial production, greenhouses, and what I can find in terms of crop production. Because there are some practices from an agricultural and land use changes that could be influenced through policy, whether it's low tillage, no tillage, whether it is using biogas on site. From that data, and when I talk to people about the data aspect, what we refer to them as scope 1, 2, and 3. I like to call them bubbles. Bubble 1 tends to be the items from a corporate point of view, but in a community point of view as well, are things that are happening in your community. So things that you could have direct control on or influence. Bubble 2 is purchased energy. So natural gas, propane, gas at the pump for vehicles, and electricity usage. And then scope 3 are things that are largely parts that you can influence. So from a corporate point of view, those are things like how employees are commuting to work, what waste they're generating, things that they're kind of out of and not directly in the control, because those are the habits of the employees and people coming to and from work. From a community point of view, the sphere 3 is very much more difficult. It's things that happen outside of your community, but they're still connected. So sometimes transportation, you take a bus, but it's a regional bus transit. If you're taking the bus within the Township of Georgian Bluffs community area, I capture that as a sphere 1. However, once you've left the boundaries and the border of the Township of Georgian Bluffs, and let's say you're going into Owen Sound, that becomes scope 3. Not going to get into the weeds, but there's nuances that I recognize when I'm doing the data interpretation. When I have the data, I also look at what we call emission factors. So greenhouse gas factors for carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and methane. And what I'm come up with for the emissions is carbon equivalents. So I look at those 3 greenhouse gases and benchmark them to carbon emissions themselves. And this is what most communities, municipalities internationally, they track as the carbon equivalents. From there, we set targets. Targets that can be set, and I like to set targets that are data driven. We have ambitious targets out there. Targets can be set to match Grey County. They can be matched internationally. They can be matched with what the province would like to do in terms of emission reductions. But in order to achieve results, I always like to look at short-term targets to help you both the corporately, but also as a community, suggestions to the community so that you can report back and say, here's what we've accomplished. So not just long-term targets for 2040 to 2050 to 2030. I can even look at targets to 2025 as suggestions. The action plan, as Peter mentioned, is he will be looking at the risk side with recommendations on how we can adapt to the impacts of a changing climate for the corporate assets. I'll be looking at it from the what we can do in terms of any changes, whether it's fuel switching, so looking at possibly electric vehicles, if that's a possibility, if that's financially viable, if that can be something that the township can do, and from who could be responsible, how much that's going to cost, what those reductions are going to look like in some of those areas. And I can also make some suggestions in the plan around community actions that tie in not only with Grey County's actions, but things that can be implementable from a community point of view, either through your committee, or it is in partnerships with, again, members of the Grey County, the things you may need to lobby to at the provincial federal level to assist you. So for example, it could be introducing electric vehicle charging stations as an example. So also working with utilities. And from there, we can identify resources and opportunities to get funding for those projects. And this, again, as I said, you've probably seen this image a number of times. We are right now, it's milestone 1 of the 3-stone milestone framework from the Partners for Climate Change Protection. So milestone 1 is create that baseline in the forecast. Milestone 2 is the emissions, and milestone 3 is developing that local action plan. And that concludes our presentation. So we are happy to have any questions from members of the committee or from Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That's a lot to take in. And I see that that's a very high level overview. So I imagine the committee does have some questions. I'm going to open it up to the committee members and encourage them to ask any questions that they may have. And you may have to just pop up some of your charts again there if they're specific to any of the material you've presented to us. Okay, anyone have any questions or comments? Luke?
Yeah, let me kick it off because it's very useful. Thank you very much to both of you. It's very, very useful, very thorough, and a lot of things that obviously, or at least I hadn't thought about, and it's very, very nice to hear the level of rigor that you by which you approach this. So there's a few. We talked earlier about the community plan, and actually, it's quite nice to see there's a fair bit of overlap. I think that I feel that the corporate plan can actually. Your risk assessments, your baseline seems to include also the community piece, the bubble 3 approach, which I thought was quite interesting. So could you elaborate a little bit in terms of what would the community plan be able to borrow from the approach you do from the corporate side? And in particular, I thought this bubble 3 approach in terms of how to use your influence, because it strikes me that actually veers into more of how do you use your bylaws, for example, or what is your zoning protocol. And basically, we have been talking a little bit about how do we apply the climate lens through all the activities of a municipality, right? All the decisions you take. And of course, it goes much wider than just your corporate assets. And it seemed to me that you were hinting in bubble 3 that would be part of your mandate. So I found that very exciting, actually. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about, is it our just kind of division that is maybe a little bit narrow-minded to say we have corporate and community, whereas in fact, you say actually there is so much overlap, like the Venn diagram, right? So I wonder if you could explain a little bit more how you see that. And then the second question, I had 2 other questions. One is your stars. In terms of where in the timeline process, in terms of where you would like to feed some feedback. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit about what you expect from this group with regards to the inputs at these different milestones. And then the third question I had was related to target setting. So I thought it was very useful to talk about short-term targets. But then the question still remains in terms of who is setting the targets and what is the experience from other municipalities in terms of how ambitious we can go without becoming unrealistic. and how do we need to think about that, basically? Thank you.
Go right ahead, folks, and if you don't mind tackling those 3 questions.
So I can talk, Peter. I can probably talk to 1 and 3 if that's fine.
Mhm. Sure.
Okay. A lot of questions. So, through you, Madam Chair. So the overlap, I'm going to do my best in a very, it's going to sound very narrow focused, but that's the scope of the work that we're looking at is a corporate lens, because they will need to dovetail into your community plan. The overlap, yes, it does exist. The best way that I can explain this is it is where data is easily available and what I can get a sense from in terms of the hardcore data. The influencing factors, all municipalities and Federation municipalities starts this as a conversation is to remind everyone that 80% of emissions across Canada, now I think the number's lowered a bit down to 60%, come from municipalities. But they never define municipalities as being just the corporate operations. They consider it your larger community. And the reason that is that there are things that in the scope 3, as I said, and you catched on as, there are things that could be influenced in terms of projects that necessarily you have as a corporate or community, the financing to put it in play. So that's where you can go to them and say, we would like to look at, so let me provide an example, not that this is the determined action that will be determined from the plan, but one of the big things a lot of people are looking at is electric vehicle charging stations and bringing in electric vehicle infrastructure into communities. That is considered scope 3 largely because it's a transportation source of peace. Unless corporately there's a decision by your council to start replacing vehicle fleets with electric vehicles, which right now I can tell you snow plows is very difficult to find anything electric vehicle snow plowed wise. Even electric trucks are very difficult to find now in the market. The charging stations tends to be a responsibility of utilities. So your utilities like to decide from a land use point of view what makes sense because it feeds into the grid, which is their responsibility. A municipality can work with the utility and the community to say, we'd like these areas through something like an official community plan, but that narrows it more into the broader official community plan could say things like, we'd like to support electric vehicle infrastructure, but actual placing of that infrastructure gets into zoning bylaws, even building codes, what can and cannot be permitted. A community action committee could definitely say, we would like to support an electric vehicle charging station. So you could do an idea around the transportation is host an electric vehicle day. See who locally has electric vehicles, allow the community to test drive them so that there's that, familiarity with this type of infrastructure and saying, okay, we'd like to support this and build that support. There will be overlap, definitely. There are spheres that, we look at it corporately, I could say, here's a potential action, but as a township, you don't have a direct control over that. It's not like you actually put that infrastructure right there where you want to be. You may need to talk to the province to see what funding is available, Federation municipality for the ability, but talk to your community as to what makes sense from a transportation infrastructure point of view and your utilities from the electric vehicles. Does that, hopefully that clarifies. I just use electric vehicles as an example, but because there will be things that I said, they will be influencing things that the township itself cannot directly do corporately, but you as a committee may be interested in to say, hey, let's look at this further as a project and see how we might be able to influence that working with partnerships. For number 3, target setting, certainly. Ultimately, the decision on target setting, what I do with target setting is I like to give 4 examples. When we're doing target setting, the first one out the door is business as usual. That means you've done nothing to address your emissions. And so that is the part of the forecasting where I look at population growth, housing development, and say, yeah, if you continue growing, you will have these types of emissions. It doesn't matter where in the township of Georgian Bout that growth happens, where the population goes to. This is basically just a projection to say if nothing is addressed, there's no target set, you will now be really extreme event. I mean, most of the times I've seen from other municipalities, it's usually like 10%, 20% higher than what you're currently as a baseline, because it assumes there's no federal influence, there's no provincial influence. You are basically growing to an extreme level, and everyone in terms of your growth happens every year for the next 10 years, and you add I'm going to ballpark, you add like 300 to 500 people a year. An unlikely scenario, but that's our baseline. I then take some of the thing, looking at the data and looking at what the province and federal government has done in terms of policies around things like energy. So reducing and more energy efficient programs and what their targets are, and then downscale that to match what you can do if you were to take up some of these policies yourself to say, yes, we'd like to go 5% energy efficiency towards new buildings. We'd like to have energy efficiency at 20%. We'd like to get into more of the step codes being introduced from us as BC. Apologies for that, but it's moving a lot of Canada towards more efficient housing on time. The targets could be long-term ambitious targets. A lot of communities you'll see in the default, those targets can be everything from 80% reduction by 2050. And that's a simple statement to say we support and trying to work with the federal government to reach these targets and the International Panel on Climate Change to reach those targets. If the question you ask them, is that reasonable? Those are ambitious targets because sometimes the timeframes can be very short in some municipal plans. I've seen some municipal plans that are suggesting that happen in 20 years or in 10 years. And I say, that's wonderful. Let me know what those programs are going to be to help you get there. But I'm glad that you're supporting to try and push, right? And that's part of the ambition side of it. I'm more of personally, I'm more of a realist on things. I like to see what it is you have that we can work on in the short term, because as I said before, and a lot of municipalities find if you get into the quandary of plans that have very ambitious targets, but no short-term view of how to get there. And reporting back is always difficult to the community, and it's difficult for staff to say, oh, we set up a target of 5% in terms of building code, and we've only had 3 buildings built in the last 2 years, and we're completely off that target, or we have no ways of measuring these sorts of targets. So we've said we wanted a 50% reduction in 10 years. We're already in year 5 reporting, and we haven't even made 5% because we just don't have the data that's available, or our controller influence hasn't been noted. So ultimately, target setting is I can make the suggestions. We can work through you as the committee and with staff in terms of, but mostly that will be looking at the corporate emission side of stuff. There will be, I can make suggestions on the community side that's very broad that could get incorporated into your official community plan. But understand that official community plans don't necessarily deal directly with things outside of land use planning. So we can talk about transportation, but again, transportation planning, sometimes it's a master plan, sometimes it's more of a regional plan in terms of Grey County. So those are things I need to consider in terms of, I looked at Grey County's targets, and I'm having discussions with Grey County to see how we can help Grey County, Township of Georgian Bluffs match with what Grey County needs to do as well. And that's also part of the problem with target setting is the province assumes that all municipalities are the same, or sometimes they don't have discussions with the municipalities on this one. And that's why working with the groups like Federation of Municipalities tells me, here's what FCM sees as reasonable, but we also need to scale it properly to what a township of Georgian Bluffs can do, especially with your rural agricultural areas that you have. But ultimately, target setting is suggestions from us as the consultants. Your council will be the ones ultimately that will determine, is it high, is it low, do they like it, yes or no?
Great. Just to confirm that what Brian's responses adequately addressed those 2 particular questions of yours. Great. So with regard to your second question around the stars on the bit of a schedule and the expectation of interaction with this particular committee, as we make our way through what I'll term the more research portion of our project and start to develop some better understanding on both sides, the GHG side and the asset risk side, we would want to engage with this committee, whether through excuse me, whether through our steering committee and their participation on this committee, Trevor and do I refer to you as Councillor Fletcher or?
How about a
Apologies. Okay.
Cynthia's our CAO.
That's right.
Okay. Or the CAO who has been party to our conversations with Trevor, or a direct presentation like we're doing today. And there are, as we've been discussing, we believe, as you do, overlap between the corporate work that we're doing and the community work that this committee is doing, and we will be looking for opportunities to advance ideas or in our work that support the community side, and vice versa. And as we always say, we understand infrastructure. At least I understand infrastructure in its many forms, and Brian is very well versed in, community GHG reporting and planning. But this community, or sorry, this committee understands your community much better than we ever could. Have driven through Owen Sound and the township many times, but I'm not a community member, and the plans that we come up with need to reflect, your aspirations and your goals. So that's the interfacing that I'm seeing with this committee and our steering committee.
Thank you, Peter and Brian. And I'm glad that you made those final couple of comments, because we do have a wealth of information here at this table from our community members, and they have, the unique and personal insights with the community because they've lived here for a number of years. So I guess my question is, and maybe I'm being preemptive, but I think we need to decide how our committee members may have input, much the same as you say staff has had some input initially in terms of what are the risks, what are the strengths. So when that can be done, and do we want that to be this entire committee, or do we strike a subcommittee to help provide some of that input? What are your thoughts on that, Peter, Brian?
Well, I think as we have pointed information needs, we will relate those to Trevor, who is our point of contact on the township side for this project, and he will make a judgment whether that information, is something that he can source directly, or if it, take his recommendation on whether it should be an open conversation like we're having today.
Okay, thank you. I would just note that, I think we need more input, perhaps even right off the hop, than what just staff can provide. And certainly they have insight and expertise in terms of what's happening at a corporate level. But our staff and council hasn't had a lot of training in climate change and climate action. And I think I'm being fair in saying that, and no disrespect intended, but I think we need to really open it up in terms of collecting information from some community folks who may be a little further along that knowledge continuum than others. So I'll just leave it at that, and hopefully, Trevor, that's something you can consider when you move forward in terms of gathering information. I will turn it over now to Anne. Go ahead, Anne.
Thank you, Chair Coburn. So my question is, you referenced steering committee a number of times, and I'm wondering, who is the steering committee? And the other question I have is how you see nature-based assets fitting in, as well as nature-based solutions fitting in, because this is a very kind of rural land-based community, and I think that that's an important question to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, and I when I'm hearing steering committee in my mind, I'm thinking you're talking about our advisory committee, No, Cynthia is saying no. So maybe that's more of a staff-based committee. I would just add to Anne's question for our consultants, and you don't have to answer this right away, but how do you see this advisory committee working with you along the steps of the way? So I'll, Cynthia, maybe you can respond to the question about steering committee.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Coburn. Steering committee is a project management terminology. So when we set up a project like this and we're bringing on consultants, we usually have a point of contact, and that is Trevor on the staffing side. But we've also then, my job as sort of the champion on the steering committee is to make sure that when we look at these timelines and processes, things are moving along as they should. And if there is reprioritization that needs to happen, or more resources that we need to bring to the table, or we need to come back to this committee and say we need to make an adjustment, that's so it's myself, it's Mr. Dahlmeyer, it's Trevor, it's our consultants that are really the steering committee. And it's essentially making sure that the project is tracking along as it should. In terms of this committee, I think you're a key advisor at points along this body of work. I mean, we're doing, staff and the consultants are doing work on a day-to-day basis. We're meeting, I think it's almost weekly, to make sure that this is tracking as it should. And absolutely, I would see this group as we're gathering information, either reviewing the information or feeding more information into the body of work. So I hope that helps to clarify the terminology around steering committee.
Yeah, I think so, but I'm just going to loop back to Anne. Is that adequate, Anne? And just in regards to your other question, have you had that answered?
So I think the steering committee question has been answered. I don't think the nature-based assets and solutions has been answered. Thank you.
Sorry. So I can deal with that. So nature-based assets, nature-based infrastructure, green infrastructure, it's got many hats, is absolutely a consideration on both the GHG side and the infrastructure side. Natural infrastructure, even though it's kind of been a forgotten thing in the past, it's very much being recognized as a contributor to the well-being of our communities. So that's certainly going to be a consideration in our deliberations on both sides, kind of the both fundamental themes of this project.
Go ahead, Anne.
Just one comment, because you did list kind of the various areas of the municipality that could be at risk from wind, storm, rain, that kind of thing. In your list, you didn't include shorelines. And that is a really significant part of Georgian Bluffs that needs to be taken into account. And I know from constituents, that's a real worry.
Mm-hmm. Especially as we see more frequent severe weather events and the impacts on our shoreline. Not only our the built environment, but even the erosion and so on. I would also note that when you talked about transportation, you made mention of Grey County, and that makes some sense. But we are also neighbors with the city of Owen Sound, and they do have transportation. And interestingly, their public transportation goes up to the border where our Sunset Strip is on the West Hill, and then stops. So I do know that there have been groups and individuals in Owen Sound who have said, can't we extend that transportation up further along sort of our business strip within Georgian Bluffs, so that folks can go from Owen Sound out along that business strip and perhaps reduce the number of individual vehicles driving along there. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that that's going to be gifted us by the city of Owen Sound, but it's certainly something that needs to be considered and discussed. Any other questions or comments from committee members? Go ahead, Bob.
Yes, I was just wondering, this is great to get the corporate plan going, and I'm just wondering if there's some sort of a protocol in terms of meshing it with the community plan. Like, I know that they're two separate entities, but hopefully they can still be developed at the same time with feedback going both ways if needed. So I guess you're considering that, or a way of dealing with that.
Go ahead, Peter or Brian, and I would also ask Trevor to jump in at this point too, because that is part of his role is the community side and having that mesh together. Peter or Brian, do you have comments before I go to Cynthia and Trevor?
Oh, I was actually going to let Cynthia, CEO Fletcher, take the floor first, and then we can follow up.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, and I'll probably talk high level, and then maybe Trevor and others can talk. I think what you've heard from the consultants is the scope of what we've brought them on board for. And one of the challenges in this whole area is it can be an enormous body of work. And so, you know, trying to bite off it in increments. So it would be my thought that we are focused on the corporate plan. Trevor is going to be looking at the community plan in parallel, but it may end up that we're at the end of this journey with our consultants, and there needs to be a next phase that we need to focus on as well. So it will not be lost. The community plan will not be lost, but it's a matter of how much can we accomplish with the resources we have in whatever time frame we've set. So that's just my high level. I'll invite, you know, others through the chair to make comment as well.
So I would open that up to the committee. I guess I gotta be honest. I sort of was considering that the community assessment, at least the community inventory, was going to move along the same time frame as the consultants are doing with the corporate side. But perhaps I'm the only one who misinterpreted those timelines. Anyone else on the committee have questions? Luke?
No, I think you're right. I think in the past I think in the notes we had a corporate community baseline by end of April, if I recall. So that was discussed a few months ago. But then that was more to support your observation. The question, I have an additional question though, and that's about, and I heard our CEO, and I agree, it needs to be realistic and implementable, and resources need to be allocated. So one of the questions I would have for the consultant, and it's going back to the timelines and the implementation, the action plan. There's a line item there about the implementation of partnership and cost and schedule. In your experience, to what extent? I guess there's a resource allocation that is associated with the climate plan, corporate climate plan. But to what extent is it also, how do I phrase this? There's probably a number of recommendations that is more about the how rather than the what, right? So it doesn't require more resources. It probably requires more political will to say, if we're actually serious about these targets, we need to take some council decisions to say we're going to do it slightly different, or we're going to be slightly more aware, or we're going to apply a climate lens, as opposed to saying, okay, we're going to go for a bigger budget, because money doesn't fix everything. It fixes something, but so to what extent do you typically, based on from what you've seen in other municipalities, to what extent does the implementation plan require additional resources as opposed to, let's say, political will? And that's maybe a bit looking in a glass ball, but I think it would be interesting to, as we determine targets, and I don't know if it's a bit of a vague question, but it seems intriguing to me to think like it's not all about resources, it's also about something else. And how much of that something else can you actually do without allocating resources?
Right.
Yeah, if I could start, I would say, my experience again, which is much more on the assets risk side, there are things that you can build that address mitigating risks, but there are also things on the policy side, and like you say, how we do things that require a change of thinking that in the community, some of the other communities that we've dealt with in Southern Ontario, you run up against some very strong competing interests, typically the development community, which are very loath to change the way they do things, particularly as it relates to ceding developable lands to, address possible future climate change risk. And that's typically where we get into a conversation, with elements within our client's organization to say, this is what the science tells us, the direction we need to go, or the direction we would recommend you going. And then it's a conversation around that political will and what are reasonable stepping stones, because a lot of times making one big jump is not going to be successful. It's just not palatable. So you try to develop a plan that's more incremented, that has a number of stepping stones that move along the path, but it can be much more acceptable politically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess further to Luke's questions and comments, I guess I would be curious to know from the consultants, at what point do we try to, how often, I guess is what I'm saying, is do we address council as a whole? I sit on this committee as a representative of council as well, and I'm a big supporter of sharing information and keeping everyone in the loop. What would be your typical approach to keeping council as a whole appraised of the consultant's work? And do you think a presentation to council might be of benefit? We can put your slide deck in there in your presentation, but when you're faced with reading literally hundreds of pages for every meeting, I think it does lose some of its impact as well, just seeing it on paper. So maybe the consultants with us today have some comments on that, and perhaps our CAO does as well.
I would say we've done any number of different approaches. We've come to some manner of final reporting through the consulting process that we've been contracted to do. And then we make a presentation to council. Other times, councillors have been made aware through, the internal organization that such a project is underway, and they've reached out with questions. Other times, we have finalized our reporting, and that's kind of where our involvement has ended, and internal forces within the community then take that through the political process. So we've done a whole gamut of different approaches.
Any thoughts on that, Cynthia? Do we have a sort of a check-in point with council at some point in time in the near future, or do we want to bring something more concrete back first?
And to you, Chair Colburn, I think if I look at the timelines in the process, I think when we get down to talking about potential strategies, or potential things that we might be looking more into, to maybe get a pulse check of council and how receptive they are to some of the strategies, and gain input from council as a whole might be a good idea. I'm not sure at the inventory stage, you know, how meaningful that's going to be, but I think as we move along the timeline and the processes, there probably is a median point where we want to get some input and do a pulse check with council. And then as we get towards a final draft, probably again, would be my thoughts just off the top of my head.
Yeah, I see some benefit to both approaches. To Luke's point and the political will, I think to have political will, there needs to be information sharing and awareness. And I know as a counselor, I don't like things sort of sprung on me after the fact either. So again, I'm just going to say I'm always in favor of sharing more rather than less. I will move this over to Anne. I think your hand was up next, and then Danuta following that.
Yes, thank you, Chair Coburn. My comment on kind of the discussion that's happening right now is I think the strategies are wonderful. Can you hear me? Okay. The strategies are good. We need to get to the strategies, but it's how to sell the strategies that are actually almost more important, because if you don't have a way of selling it, then what we end up with is another really good consultation report. And I guess my question to the consultants is, will you have kind of suggestions to the committee to how to promote what the report will be recommending? That's probably my bigger question. My other comment is on the adaptation side. You've talked about water and water processing plants. I think it's really important to remember that a good percentage of the constituents of Georgian Bluffs are either on wells or shoreline wells. And the kind of risks of climate change on both of those, I think, can be really, really significant and need to be taken into account. Thank you.
That's a really good point. I'll turn that over to Peter and Brian at this point. You're just on mute, Peter.
Thank you. I always find I speak very eloquently and nobody hears anything. Yes, absolutely, and thank you for bringing those aspects to this meeting. Absolutely, we understand, you know, the potential for climate change to influence groundwater levels. I haven't looked specifically at the research that might be relevant to the township, but that will certainly be an element of it, and certainly changing water levels in Georgian Bay as it might influence shoreline erosion, like we've spoken about already, development of wave action with changing storm frequency or direction or intensity, and then obviously changing lake levels as an influence on those near shore water supply systems. So all of those elements will certainly be touched upon.
Okay, thank
and
you.
I think if I could just add one thing, this represents, again, the crossover, I think, in part to the community plan, in that we're looking at corporate assets, and some of those home-based water supply systems don't come under the ownership of the township, but certainly some of the information that we will will document in our reporting will have that crossover opportunity to the community plan.
Yeah, perfect. Stormwater management continues to be a huge challenge for our municipality. I think it's, you mentioned earlier that that's not unique to Georgian Bluffs, but in many cases, I feel like our infrastructure where that issue is concerned has not kept pace. with the need. So that's definitely on the risk side of things, and has proven to be a huge concern of our residents as well. So Anne, is that sufficient for your question?
Actually, I don't think the other part of my question in terms of will the consultants be able to share strategies around selling the plan, and kind of both to community, if there's community parts, but particularly to council, who ultimately is in charge of endorsing and implementing that plan.
And can I add too to staff, because council is very much influenced by the opinions and recommendations of staff. So I think, that's an important part of that equation as well. So yeah, strategies, Peter and Brian, thoughts on that question?
Yeah, on the asset side, I touched about some of that already, but generally it's in presenting a path and a roadmap, an adaptation roadmap, or action plan that is practical and reasonable. Not that we come and make a recommendation that the township needs to spend tens of millions of dollars to upgrade infrastructure, because that's probably just going to be unreasonable, and not within the township's immediate ability to do. We can the inference for why the overall plan should move forward will come down to the risks that are identified. If there are significant risks, then those can certainly be highlighted. And Brian mentioned, the do nothing, scenario, where, to be clear, if nothing's done, certain things, there'll be potential loss of service, possibly as the nearshore wells will run into trouble. The stormwater system is undersized, will lead to more frequent flooding, these sorts of things. So that will be the front end conversation, that climate change does pose a risk. We've identified what some of those risks are, kind of the scale of those risks, and where the focus of any action should take place to mitigate those risks. And Brian, I don't know, apologies, Brian, I don't know if you wanted to add something on the GHG side.
I will, Peter. It's just through you, Madam Chair. So on the mitigation side of stuff, which is funny because, as Peter said, mitigation sometimes is what adaptation wording is. This is the reason I look at the corporate strategic plan, official community plan works, because I look at things that there is the appetite already for, that a council can say, oh, does this require, this is the fine line of strategy versus here's actual recommendations. Some actual I hate the word actual financial recommendations where you can find funding for. There is money. You just need to get someone to do the grant or the application for, versus the overall big P political scene of the what can you, again, as I said before, influence, or what is there an appetite for already. Because part of the recommendations we have to consider here too is any recommendations made for implementations of action suggested should have a look at, on a corporate side, what resources are currently available, what might need to be available, but the workload already of staff to make sure that this isn't taking on more that they already have on their platter. On the community side, this is why we get into the word partnership, because I said before, there are partners in your community, and some of the initial steps strategically is to reach out to them. So there may be things that we look at from a renewable energy point of view or an energy efficiency point of view to see what programs are being offered by utilities in the area, and have that discussion with your local utility providers to say, and so I'm going to give an example that I know Ontario has some programs, BC has slightly different programs, but around the traditional energy efficiency programs of retrofitting housing, getting people who have certain energy bills with the utilities on board to say, here's how we can reduce that energy usage. Those programs sometimes, in some communities, those are run by the municipality, others they're by the utilities, and sometimes there are also local nonprofit groups. So that is where I'm getting sort of a sense in the partnership side of the strategic plans of there are things that may not be on your corporate strategic plan, but are there things that the community is interested in? The recommendations would be if there's a strong groundswell for those actions, how do we do that? Because that's not currently on the table. So strategically thinking of what partners you may want to bring to the table, working with the action committee. So a bigger, so my example is when I was doing the climate change plan for the city of Hamilton, one of the influences I had was I actually met with some of my local industries. I mean, unfortunately, I had steel companies, but had the steel companies and the utilities present to council as well in tandem with the report so that they understood from a business point of view, the businesses already said this is a good idea. We're doing this because we're concerned about the risks, but there's also energy savings to this that can support lower savings to your tax citizens as well. So I don't know if that's the best example, but that might be a roundabout. That just strategies are always, strategies is a very, I understand where your committee is coming from. That is the biggest thing, is how do you do that influence when you don't have those partnerships yet? This is where, when it comes to components to a community plan, we may do those recommendations of here's who the implementers are. So when we say who, it may not be yourself as the township or the climate action committee. It may be you need to partner with the utilities. You may need to partner with people that are operating your water treatment plant, the contractors, and see how you can have that actual first step is always the discussion of the here's something that came up. Are you aware of it? To make them aware of the plan, and then see where your spheres of influence, as we like to say in the big politic world, from a community point of view and from a township point of view of who can talk to who and drive things.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, those are some good examples. Before I go to Danuta, we've made mention a few times of recommendations that are doable, that are feasible. I'm all in favor of that. I am hoping, and please clarify for me, that we will get the data we need to get, and it could be the good, the bad, and the ugly. But what I don't want to see is a sugar-coated, personally, I don't want to see a sugar-coated report come back if we have huge problems that may take millions of dollars to fix. I think we still need to know that, even though it may not be feasible to attack those big ticket items down the road. So I'm trying not to misinterpret what you're saying about reasonable recommendations. We do need to know completely what the risks are and how to tackle them for the short term, but also what we need to do for the long term. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I was just going to quickly say, I mean, if us sugarcoating something doesn't provide you any benefit, that's probably just a manner of kicking problems down the road. We have no interest in doing that. I mean, you've hired us to help you understand what your risks or what your opportunities on the GHG side might be, and on assets, and we will present you with a scientific and engineering-based report that lays that out very clearly, and the more of the planning and strategizing part comes into, if there are big risks that need to be tackled, how do we best frame those in a way that are actually doable?
Thank you. That puts my mind at ease. Perfect. Over to you, Danuta. Sorry, you've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. I wanted to be able to say something in all of this discussion I've been listening to. And thank you for your report and presentation. And I guess I just wanted to add a small part in here. I think so much is important on communication, keeping in touch with all these levels that are here. We're a community of citizens, and then council representation and staff representation and your professionals. And it's so easy to lose sight of who's communicating with who and how the information is being disseminated. And I'm thinking about the idea of climate literacy or using common languages. And the adoption of a climate lens is something a lot of grassroots organizations have been really trying to get their councils to accept. And with varying success and often not much success as part of their official plan. And I'm just wondering if adopting some common phrases like that, if that might not be the most appropriate one, in dialogue with council members and others, so that we can actually feel like we're talking about the same thing.
Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Chair Coburn, you are on mute.
Touche. I'm usually the one calling others out on that. I apologize. Go ahead and jump in there, Brian, Peter, Cynthia. I do agree we all need to be talking the same language. Danuta, I think we've made some strides. I managed to get some wording about climate action in our strategic plan. It may have been a bit of an afterthought, but and we are doing, Cynthia, correct me if I'm wrong, an official plan revision that will certainly, I hope, include that common language as well. But from the consultant's perspective, I'll just turn it over to Peter and Brian.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, we run up against this all the time, and even if we're, verbalizing the same words, a lot of the time, different parties have fundamentally different understandings of what those words actually mean. So for our reporting, we will certainly include a glossary of terms, and if the township has already started along that path and has certain words that they use in very particular contexts, that would be our starting point. But we've worked with Canadian Standards Association on development of standards, and that's a very key item in developing new standards and in any of our reporting where we have large groups or documents that are going to become public. We like to be very discreet in our meaning and use of certain words. So that will be defined in a glossary, either in an appendix or at the front end of the reporting, to say if you see this word in the context of this report, this is what we mean.
Perfect. Yeah. That sounds good. Danuta, does that help address those points? Thank you. And I see your hand is up. I'll go to you next. Oh, that's from before. Anyone else questions for our consultants while we have them here? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, this is probably down in the weeds a little bit, but we're aware of new building developments taking place in Georgian Bluffs that are, hooking people up to brand new homes with natural gas and propane, and we just kind of wonder where we're at. We should probably be going to electric air source heat pumps, but we're just putting lots of carbon dioxide out there, and or carbon out there, I should say. And I just wondered, there'll probably be some recommendations somehow in the work that you're doing to kind of get away from this, and then there'll have to be a process put in place to actually change how we do things. But time goes by and we don't see anything. It's still business as usual, it seems. And I know that Ontario's big on putting in natural gas still, and it's a bad thing. So I just hope that you'll be addressing that somehow. And that is down into the weeds a bit, but that's it's a concern.
No, I think that's a fair point. Peter, Brian?
I was just going to say, we've on kind of the engineering side, and as a homeowner myself, I've always advocated, one of the first things I did was put low flush toilets in my home. But when you go to your Home Depot or your local Lowe's or whatever, hardware store you use, the cheapest option you have, in my example for a toilet, uses the most water.
Yeah.
So it's many of those that might be considered early adopters. We have the wherewithal to spend a little bit more money, but I have found that fundamental change generally happens when the rules change, when you don't give people the option of buying the inefficient model. Whatever theme of infrastructure you're talking about. generally moving forward in time, there are things that we are going to change that are going to save us money, but to the same token, there are things that are going to change that are going to cost us a little bit more money. And as a society, we need to collectively decide that this is the direction we want to go, and this is the changes that we're going to have to accept.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure, because sometimes it comes down to personal cost for folks in the moment, right?
Yeah.
But it's definitely something that we need to look at. And there are a number of homes in our municipality who heat by wood burning stoves. So over to you, Anne. Or sorry, Cynthia, did you want to respond to that last comment?
Yeah, no, it's great discussion. And I think this goes back to Brian's comment earlier, is there are things that we'll look at a township, at a local level that we can influence. But it is also in a topic like how we're heating our homes, or if we're talking at waste diversion, waste management, those kinds of things. Those are also areas that we really need the other levels of government. Sort of to your point, Peter, helping to influence us to move in a different direction, or even incent people to move in a different direction as well. So, it's some policy work, but it might also be some incentives as well. So, I think that's an area where we've got some things to do at a local level, but it may be advocating with other levels of government as well. So
I totally agree. Another example, my extended family is in Austria, and my uncle was a councillor in his local community for many, many years. I mean, a very small community, about 4,000 people. And they just decided as council one day that they were going to change the way they were doing things. And in order to get a building permit for new construction, particularly residential, you required a multi-fuel heating system. You required a certain amount of passive solar generation capacity. You needed a rainwater cistern, and these sorts of things. And these kind of goes to our previous conversation that these are not things that people would have typically opted for if it wasn't a requirement.
And we've seen that in many aspects of society, right? Like even seatbelt use, there was lots of education and awareness and fact sharing, but ultimately it took laws and fines in order for that to be more universally accepted and adopted. So yeah, you're right. Anne, over to you.
Yeah, my comment through you, Kathy, to our CEO, Cynthia. I really, really support the idea of incentives combined with kind of expectations. And you were talking about kind of the toilet and purchasing the toilet, and I'm assuming that's when you have a home. We could put some expectations in for developers as they're building homes. So expectations around energy efficient heating systems or whatever, and kind of becoming clear as to who has the authority to do that and who else do we need to advocate with to make that happen.
Yeah, and just really quickly from a planning perspective, it's our local level, and it's also the county level that has some influence as to our official plan fits in with the county's official plan as well. So
definitely. Okay, we've had a great discussion, lots of questions and ideas bouncing around. I don't see any more hands in the air, and I do note that it's past 11:30. So I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Peter and Brian for coming to this meeting today and speaking to us and providing us with your plan. And we hope to hear back from you again, hopefully in the not too distant future. And we're really excited to see ultimately the plan that you produce for us. And before that, of course, we're all curious about the inventory and the baselines. So thank you very much for coming today.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today. Great conversation, and we too look forward to, working through this process with everyone.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so we will move ahead with our agenda. We have 3 items under correspondence, and I would just draw those to your attention. I don't think we need to spend time discussing them unless there's something in particular. I was a little curious about item 6.1, our common future, and where that document has, Peter, maybe I'll go back to you. I'm sorry, I just saw your hand up.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, do you need Brian and I to continue in on the meeting?
I do not think so, no.
No. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone, and look forward to the next time we meet.
Have a good day, folks. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, so I was curious about the first item of correspondence and where that has come from on the agenda, and I wonder if Brittany or Carly can shed some light on that particular one. Go ahead, Carly.
Yeah, so this item was circulated via email by Deputy Mayor Sue Carleton. So she had requested that it be included and had also circulated it via email to the committee for their information.
Thank you, and I had forgotten that. I would just note that this is a very old document. It's quite dated. So while I have to confess I did not read through that entire document, I did look at the date and wonder if it still has much relevance. I could be entirely wrong. I don't know if anyone on staff has read that document or feels that it may be relevant in some way, but I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, I do find the FCM fact sheets to be very helpful from a council perspective. So I'm hoping my colleagues on council have taken some time to look at those as they've been circulated from FCM through emails. So on to number 7. We don't have to, Carly, we don't have to accept the items of correspondence. Just note that they're there for committee's perusal if they choose.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Okay, staff reports, I see that there's nil. I invite Trevor if there's anything you have to offer, or Steve. It looks like we've lost Cynthia. I think she only can commit to an hour and a half for these meetings. But Trevor, is there anything you and Steve would like to add at this time? Stephen?
Through you, Chair Coburn, to the committee. At this time, we don't have anything to discuss, but we were just more focused in on the consultant presentation today in that corporate plan portion. So at this time, we have nothing.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Public question period. I have not been made aware of any questions from members of the public. I imagine Carly will, or Brittany is saying no. Thank you. So unfinished business. I think I'm going to go ahead and encourage this next conversation, just asking that we keep the time frame in mind. But for this item 9.1, the carbon footprint challenge, if it's okay, I believe, Anne, you were the one who asked for that to be on the agenda, so I'll just turn that over to you at this time.
And actually, Councillor Coburn, I think it's Brittany that is actually going to speak to this. Thank you.
Thank you. My mistake.
Yes.
Sorry, Brittany.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Chair Coburn. And yes, I do intend to be brief today. The So following our meeting last month, a steering committee, I say quote unquote steering committee, was formed between myself, our vice chair, Ann Schneider, a member of the public, Jenny Carver, and our climate action coordinator, Trevor Donald, to discuss rollout and a strategic implementation of the carbon footprint tool that we were introduced to last month. So the steering committee, and again, I encourage everyone to note I'm using quotations when I note that, has met a couple of times, and we've discussed kind of fun ways that we can entice and incentivize our community to get involved with this tool and start kind of, I don't want to say pushing, but encouraging everyone to get involved with the climate action portfolio. So while it's still kind of a high level idea, I'll have a report to this committee next month to determine how we're going to roll it out and the steps in which this community can be involved in. What we're thinking is using the metrics out of the tool to measure certain milestones of achievements. And when the community hits a certain milestone, I'm recommending that the township commit to planting trees throughout the municipality. So every time the community, every time, for example, when our first 100 people sign up, we plant so many trees at this space throughout the township, and defining certain milestones and tracking them and giving regular updates to the committee through our website, or to our community through the website and through this committee platform. So high level, just wanted you all to know that we are continuing to meet on it and are continuing to work on fun new ways to get the community involved.
I love it. I think that's brilliant. Thank you to the committee for that work, and to you, Brittany. I know if there's anyone who can add a little dose of fun to an initiative, it's going to be you. So thank you. We all appreciate that, and we look forward to hearing more about that at the next meeting. Okay, under new business, number 10, I had a conversation with our CAO regarding the duration of these meetings, and there is some desire to try to keep the meetings to an hour and a half. That's really, in terms of staff time, that's all that these folks can commit to. I feel like we are on better footing now with the consultant on board, and I will work with Cynthia and likely Brittany and Carly as well to continue to review the agendas ahead of time, make sure that they are focused, and that they reflect the work of an advisory committee as opposed to a working committee or a task force. So I just wonder if I have some consensus among committee members to go ahead and try to keep those agendas tight and our time frame to an hour and a half. Any objections to that? Okay, perfect. And I did assume that the meeting today would run a little longer because we did have that important presentation from our consultants, and I wanted to allow lots of time for questions and comments from committee. So thank you for that. I don't see any notices, or I should ask, are there any notices of motion coming from the committee members? I wasn't made aware of any, and I see no hands up. We have no closed session today. And so just a reminder that our next regular meeting will be March 17th at 10 a.m. I may or may not be able to attend that particular meeting. I will chat with my vice chair and closer to the time and confirm. And so if there is nothing else, I would just ask that someone move to adjourn the meeting today. Is there someone who will move that? Thank you, Danuta. And all in favor? Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to staff for your help and diligence, and we'll see you in March.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.